They jumped and started running back and forth, waving guns and grenades and shouting, "This airplane is hijacked." My parents and my older brother and myself are in the danger of being slaughtered.
An Air France jet was hijacked by Palestinian guerrillas today. On board, 9 Americans, some 80 Israelis, and 157 other passengers. The jet was going from Tel Aviv to Paris with a stop in Athens.
We drove in the morning to Ben Gurion Airport. Both my parents, mother and father, who are currently 89, God bless them, and my older brother Ron to the airport. For Ron and for me, it was the first time actually to fly outside of Israel, be that as it may. I was 13, my brother was 17 at the time, and we were supposed to board an Air France flight flying to Paris and then exchange planes and continue with the flight to New York and then rent a car and for a whole month spend a coast-to-coast trip in the U.S. That was bar mitzvah present for myself. And prior to joining the army, present for my older brother Ron. We didn't know about the layover in Athens, so nevertheless we landed in Athens, and there was like a 30 minutes or an hour break. And I remember that my father and my brother and myself stepped out to the steps on the back door, taking a look on beautiful Athens. I remember I was trying to locate the Acropolis. And then after half an hour or so, they called us back. We sat in 4 middle seats, roughly towards the back of the airplane, the end of the airplane galley. And several minutes after takeoff, we heard a high-pitched shrill or yell from the front, from the business class. And my mother immediately looked at my father, put a hand on his knee, and said, "We're being hijacked." And my father told her, "Listen, Sarah, you're afraid of flights and everything, so probably somebody doesn't feel well, and it will sort out in a few minutes." But regretfully, she was right. And a few seconds later, we saw a French stewardess walking back from business class towards our coach class on the left aisle, to be followed by a German woman terrorist holding a gun to her head and waving a grenade in another hand. At the same time, 2 Arab terrorists that were, Arabs that boarded the plane in Athens, just passengers like us, jumped out of their seats. They were sitting 2 rows behind us on the aisle seats, and they jumped and started running back and forth, waving guns and grenades and shouting, "This airplane is hijacked." And I assume you've been to flights many times, so you can imagine how all hell breaks loose in such horrific minutes. The blood runs out of your veins. You feel cold, and there were lots of shouting and yelling and crying. But I have to admit that what was cemented in me in those initial, possibly horrific minutes, were 3 things that are escorting me ever since and came in very handy in my life. The first one was that while the terrorists were running around and waving guns, my father, who sat on the right aisle, took a brief look to the left towards my mother, myself, and my brother, who sat on the left aisle, and told us very quietly, not panicking, not shouting, "Please move forward a little bit in your seats and sit lower. So if there is a stray bullet, you're not getting hit." A very short command with no hysteria, telling us what to do. And to me, that's cemented as taking control of the of a situation that is very, very chaotic. The second thing was that after several minutes, our new captain, the German terrorists, ordered everybody to collect their flight tickets and passports and any document for his comrades to take. And my father, being the father of the family, held all documents with him. So he prepared it in a small nylon bag, and he found in his wallet his Air Force entry base pass that was with him. My father was a captain in the Israeli Air Force, an active combat navigator. And that's a piece of information you don't want terrorists to know. So instead, again, panicking and becoming hysterical, he simply tore it to 4 pieces while the terrorists are roaming the aisles back and forth, gave each one of our family members a quarter of this small card. Thankfully enough, it was not made of plastic back in the 70s, but of carton. And we continued to tear it apart to small pieces, putting it in our mouths and turning it into small paper balls and throwing it in a soft drink can in the seat in front of us. And within a couple of minutes, we were culprits, so to speak, but hiding real evidence about a colonel in the Israeli Air Force. My mother opened her purse and found 3 items that her mother gave her just when we said goodbye on Ben Gurion Airport. And one of them was Valium pills. And until today, 47 years thereafter, my mother cannot explain why her mother gave her Valium pills for a trip to the U.S. But nevertheless, without thinking again, my mother gave me a Valium, and my older brother and herself. She offered one for my father. You can imagine that he declined. But those small gestures and decisions that were made in a blink of a second were cemented in me in a way that even if you're getting hijacked and you fear for your life in those initial tragic moments, you can still take some control of what's going on. And that pattern continued through the whole of that week.
And when did you get a sense that you were going to be taken to Uganda, that Jewish hostages and non-Jewish hostages were going to be separated? How did those events play out?
So we landed on Monday, early morning, actually very, very late at night, like 4 a.m. in the morning, I think, in Entebbe. We did not know, David. Let's remember, the plane was hijacked after takeoff from Athens. That was roughly around 9 or 10 a.m. in the morning. They told us to close the shutters, and we tried to figure out where they're taking us. And only after landing in Libya, in Benghazi Airport, and the airplane was surrounded by the Libyan army, that we understood that we're now in Libya, in Muammar Gaddafi's backyard. And it was, quite frightening, because Libya still today does not have any relations with Israel. Then after an hour or so, we took off again, and I'm jumping the parts that you need to go to the bathroom, and you have a terrorist escorting you from your seat to the toilet with the gun in the back of your head, waiting for you outside, and then escorting you back to your seat. So there were lots of horrors during that flight, but we did not know that we're in Benghazi only after landing, and certainly after takeoff. We did not know where they're taking us. They didn't tell us. And my father, being a navigator, knowing the Airbus and fuel capacity and speed and so on and so forth, tried to calculate where can we go. I can tell you that he forecasted even going to China, but no one estimated or forecasted that we're going to Middle Africa, to Uganda, and to Entebbe. We landed there on Monday early morning with the shutters closed, and then after a couple of hours, and remember, we're sitting in that same airplane from Sunday morning, so more than 24 hours we're sitting within the airplane. They allowed us to open the shutters, and then we saw the old terminal of Entebbe, and us Israelis, we're always optimistic, so we had a relief. We said, okay, they brought us here to Uganda, and we remember that Idi Amin and the government of Israel had good relation in the 60s, and probably there is some kind of a deal in the making, and we will disembark and we'll get some couple of biscuits and juices, and we will be sent off. We were wrong, because when we started disembarking the airplane, we were walked between two rows of Ugandan soldiers armed head to toe, and that was not an honor guard. And when we saw the terrorists hugging other terrorists waiting for them on the ground, and Idi Amin and his soldiers exchanging handshakes and hugs and blessings, we took it for what it's worth, that we're 4,000 kilometers away from Israel, and we are under the guards of 10 terrorists, over 100 Ugandan soldiers, and one lunatic dictator in the name of Idi Amin. The following day, they collected all the passports in the airplane, as you remember, and then they said, we're going to start reading names, and whomever is being called, take your belongings and go to the other side of the wall. Two armed soldiers broke an opening in the wall, and we saw that there is another room, an adjacent room. Again, being optimistic, because we're 250 passengers and crew in a very crowded and filthy old terminal, we thought that they're making our lives a little easier by, sending some of us, offloading the congestion, so to speak, to the other room. By the third name, we understood. Just looking, and I was 13, so I knew all about the Holocaust. Just looking at my parents and the other adults' faces, we knew that a selection is being made again. And we're in 1976, 30-odd some years after 1944. And another selection is being made, and the selection is being made by German terrorists, 2 German terrorists. The Arabs did not call the name, nor the Ugandans. Only the female and male terrorists, German terrorists, called the names, and it was quite a shock for the Israelis, and even those who resemble to some extent Jewish people were selected to move to the other side. But, those are very hard moments. But at the same time, like in the airplane, also on the ground, my parents enacted me and Ron, as the same as the other parents of the children of Entebbe, with routines on an hourly basis, like building the library or playing backgammon or chess or reading books or talking or whatever. And those daily routines, waking up in the morning, brushing your teeth, eating breakfast, washing the dishes, taking roles in being a librarian in a certain hour of day, exchanging books with other passengers, talking with them about the books, getting to know others. It's horrific. The situation is horrific. But, and let's remember, we're not in the tunnels of Hamas, and I'm sure we'll get to that later. But the situation is unimaginable on one hand, and our parents enacted us in such a routine daily chores way that made it, so to speak, possible or possible. And I think that attributed a lot to my ability to survive that, mainly mentally, and not getting scarred or traumatized.
What did you imagine was going on the ground in Israel? What was you and your family's knowledge of how the Mossad and the IDF and those kind of organizations operate in this kind of situation? And how conscious were you? How much belief did you have that some kind of rescue attempt would be made?
Let's remember, David, we're in 1976, back in the 70s. No satellites, no internet, no iPhones, no real intelligence, except for human intelligence. We didn't know anything about what's going on in Israel. Every time the Idi Amin came with his entourage and the Ugandan TV, some of the hostages moved forward into the frame, assuming that the frame will catch them and those broadcasts will go somehow back into Europe, Israel, the US, and in such a way that our families will get a hint that we're alive. Any estimation about a military operation was shut down immediately by my father, who knew the Air Force very well, and said, the Israeli Air Force does not have airplanes that can reach here and come back to Israel, and there is no refueling point nearby that can enable such an operation. Hence, no viable operation is possible. Idi Amin, on the second or third day, demanded us to write a letter, us, the hostages, to write a letter to the government of Israel demanding the release of those 53, they call them freedom fighters, we all call them terrorists, and the payment of $5 million, which was the ransom. Those were their demands. And I remember as a 13-year-old boy, a very harsh deliberation, even in shouts at some points, between the Israeli hostages, including my parents, whether it is right for us as hostages to make such a demand without knowing the whole picture and what's going on in Israel and worldwide. Eventually, the vote was yay and not nay, but both my parents voted against. And that was quite an important lesson for me as a 13-year-old boy, that even though my parents and my older brother and myself are in the danger of being slaughtered, let's remember the deadline was for Thursday noontime. Even though our lives are at stake, my parents were not willing to push the government to enter negotiations with terrorists and address their demands. Those were the days in the 70s with the leadership, and my parents, although it might have saved my life, they didn't know about the operation coming and the Mossad working behind the scenes and everything, thought that the principles of Zionism and Judaism and integrity and moral, that Kol Israel Chaverim, all Israel are friends with one another, and all Israel are vouching for one another, are more important, and they rely on the leadership, even though my father said no military operation is possible, rather than to write such a letter. Such a letter was never sent at the end of the day, but that was a very hard lesson cemented in me at age 13. Fast forward to Saturday noontime, I sat and played backgammon with a friend of mine, Akiva Laxel. He was older than me, and he was on his way to the Olympic Games in Montreal. And I threw the dice, and he threw the dice, and we exchanged some talks and things like that. And all of a sudden, I said to him, "You'll see, Akiva, tonight at midnight, the IDF will come." Just like an enlightenment, so to speak. Like a bulb went out on my head. And Akiva stopped the game, put a hand on my forehead. He thought I'm hallucinating and having fever, because dysentery broke out earlier the day before, and my brother was having a high fever, and he thought that I caught it as well, and starting hallucinating and imagining things about the IDF. And he told me, "Listen, your father said that the IDF cannot come." I told him, "Listen, with all due respect to my father, you'll see tonight at midnight they will come." But up until that moment, I hadn't even thought about the possibility, and simply relied on the grown-ups that said, there is no solution. Let's remember that on Thursday, 11 o'clock in the morning, 1 hour before the deadline expires, and two of us are selected to get murdered, Idi Amin came in and told us that the government of Israel decided to enter negotiations with the Palestinians, with the terrorists, and hence they are delaying the deadline from Thursday noontime to Sunday, to the following Sunday at noontime. Now, one may ask, how can the late Rabin, Mr. Rabin, who was the prime minister at the time, decided to change a policy that prevailed since the inception of Israel? Because David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, enacted a policy that Israel is not talking or negotiating with terrorists. And that lasted until 1976. And all of a sudden, Mr. Rabin decided to change such a long-time policy. And since I started lecturing about my personal experience and the resilience and how to survive a terror event, I talked to many officials, both in the army and in the government, that were in action at the time. And I was told that it was twofold. One, the military operation until Wednesday or early morning Thursday was not a real viable solution. And hence, Mr. Rabin, being the leader that he was, took a very brave decision, told the Mr. Begin, who was the head of the opposition, "This is what I'm going to do. Please support us, because we have no other way." And we all know what transpired on Saturday night.
So what is your most clear memory of the second you knew that a military operation was happening?
The second I knew that something is happening was the initial shots. The experience that is cemented in me for the last 47 and a half years is that a tower of glass bottles is crashing to the ground. But my parents, again, being very brave and very sharp, took it for what it is and took us to the toilets nearby that were shielded to some extent from a direct line of fire coming from the outside. We did not know that these are the IDF soldiers. I did not remember my prophecy from that day at noontime, and we thought that we're getting slaughtered. So I find myself lying on the ground with my mother covering me with her body. My brother and father roughly at the same position with other hostages who fled to the toilets area, and all hell broke loose. And there were shots of guns and submachine guns and machine guns and grenades and RPGs and whatever for long minutes. And I was lying on the ground, facing down, and saying, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, with personal addition of myself, God please save us, don't let us die. We didn't know that those are Israelis, and after several minutes of a very hard fight in the terminal and outside of the terminal, somebody shouted, hey, there are Israeli soldiers here. And the shots in the terminal stopped. They continued the fight outside, but in the terminal, the shots stopped, and we raised our head. We're lying on the ground, looking up to the soldiers standing, and we saw a couple of soldiers. Amir Ofer and Amos Goren were the first two soldiers of commando unit led by Yoni Netanyahu, who came to the back of the terminal after eliminating the terrorists and looked down at us, smiling and saying, hey, we came to take you home. Take your belongings, go outside. Our soldiers are waiting for you, and we'll take you to an airplane that will fly you back home. As simple as that. So, and there are many stories and anecdotes of during the fight and the fight that was outside of the tarmac while we ran into the Hercules and they blew up the MiGs. I can go for hours.
So how did you feel when you started to gain confidence that you were indeed safe, that you had been rescued?
Immediately when we saw the soldiers, I was not shaking, I was not yelling, I was not crying. The whole four of us ran on the tarmac for like 500 or 600 meters with two Golani soldiers, one on the right, one on the left, escorting us until we saw the high tail in the dark night of Entebbe of the C-130. And I don't know how, but I felt safe. Even when we landed in Nairobi, and then my father, who actually the captain of our Hercules was in the same squadron of his. So he came down when we landed in Nairobi and looked up my father and said, are you all okay? Is your family okay? So, there's such small circles that all Israelis know one another to some extent. So imagine that the captain of our C-130 who rescued us was a squad member of my father from the Israeli Air Force. And they met in Nairobi for the refueling. And my father was right, but he didn't know that the Mossad had an office in Kenya, in Nairobi, to enable such the ability to refuel the Hercules, the C-130s, and fly back to Israel. And again, the flight back to Israel was a very dangerous one. My father knew that it's a very, very long and very dangerous flight because we're flying near Yemen and near Saudi Arabia and near Egypt and near Ethiopia. All of them were fierce enemies of Israel. And he was standing near the small window on the side door of the C-130 where the paratroopers usually jump out. There is a small circle window. And he was just looking for the whole of the flight. I sat with my mother and my brother, but I saw that he was standing. So at some point of time, when we got closer to Israel and daylight broke, I stood up and asked him, what are you looking for? He answered with one word, phantoms, F-4s. My father knew the risk of the flight, and he knew that as soon as we get closer enough to the state of Israel, the Israeli Air Force F-4s will escort us. And once we saw them, and I saw them with him, as soon as they sat on our wings, on our right and left, only then he was willing to sit down and be confident that, okay, they've got our tail, we're closer to the borders of Israel, and it's okay.
You touch down and the days pass and the weeks pass. When did you begin to appreciate the detail of the audacity of this rescue and the planning and the execution?
Again, my parents. We landed in Israel on July 4th, Sunday. On July 14th, 10 days later, we took off again in an El Al direct flight to New York for a whole month spent the same coast-to-coast gift trip for me and for my brother to the letter. And I always say in my lecture that I'm not a anti-terror specialist. I'm not a military specialist. But the best acamol against terror is to go back immediately as you can to your routines and to your original plans and continue with life. And that's what happened to the four of us. And of course, there are many parties and celebrations and ceremonies that we took part of, but I didn't dive into the details of the operation and the bravery and the skills of the IDF and the leadership of our brave leadership then, only after 40 years, when I started lecturing about my experience, I decided that it's not enough for me to bring the details from the terminal of Entebbe as a hostage, but I want to bring the other side, what happened in Israel during that time. So I learned each and every piece of information, and I'm quite knowledgeable about what happened in Israel, during that week that we spent there. And we had lots of luck, I have to admit. One of the pilots, when they landed in Israel, was interviewed by Mr. Rabin, and Mr. Rabin asked him, how was it? Was it according to plan? And Shiki Shani, who was the captain of the squadron leader of the first airplane, told him, well, Mr. Prime Minister, God worked extra hours during that operation. So we had a lot of luck, and it was a very daring and courageous operation that, you need a very strong leadership and government to take such a brave, some would call it crazy, decision.
The commander of the rescue mission, Yoni Netanyahu, tragically lost his life. Benjamin Netanyahu is the current leader of Israel. How much do you think his worldview of the Middle East and his view of terrorism was shaped by what happened to Yoni?
Well, Yoni was a scar for me personally for many years. I felt guilty, as if almost on a personal level that Israel lost a great leader because of me, because of us. And I felt so ashamed that it took me 40 years to go to Mount Herzl, to his memorial service. And on the 40th anniversary, I went there and spoke on behalf of the hostages. Now, I have my theories on Bibi. I know Bibi very well. I met him in person several times following the memorial services of Yoni. I know his father, his late father, Benjamin Netanyahu, who was a professor, a historical history professor. They were brought up in a very right, I would say, wing home. And I think at the initial days or years following Yoni's death, let's remember, Bibi was living in the United States at the time in 1976. He left Israel. His name was Benjamin Netanyahu, and he was following a career in the United States. He didn't plan to come back to Israel. Following Yoni's death, he came back to Israel and joined politics. And I think that at the initial years, being an ambassador in the UN, he had been doing a very good job. Bibi is a great marketing guy. one of the experts. But if I need to allude to the days that we're having now, and I cannot regretfully escape, because following the Black Saturday, a lot have changed, both in Israel, both in the region, as well as worldwide. I'm sorry to say that this messiah, extreme right-wing government lost any trust by the people of Israel. You all know about the protests that were made during the judicial coup, which we managed to stop. Regretfully, we didn't manage to overthrow this government before the Black Saturday. And what runs my blood hot is the actions of this government following the Black Saturday, led by Benjamin Netanyahu. His brother took his commando forces, amongst with 220 fighters, to an operation that was really a crazy operation. But they followed a simple theme or subject, which is caring for any Jews or Israeli that are caught captive anywhere in the world, even with sacrificing their lives. And he only fell on those principles of Judaism, Zionism, integrity, and moral of caring for his fellow Israeli people. Regretfully, I have to say, Bibi is doing exactly the other way around. That's what's happening in these days. The government went into a war, a very just war, with Hamas, who needs to be eradicated, because anybody who raises a hand, not to say performs horrific crimes against humanity to our people or to any people around the world, does not deserve to breathe the air on this world. But we thought initially that our brave army could eliminate Hamas within a couple of months or so. That would be fine with me. But we're 3.5 months into this battle. We are reducing forces in Gaza. We are losing support from decent Western world, and simply because the government is not willing to discuss the day after, on one hand, and is not doing the utmost, ultimate, sacred task, and it's to save the 136 hostages. So we are in a deep crisis, not just in a military level, but we're in a deep crisis internally. And the crisis is not as it may be portrayed outside of Israel between right and left. This is simply not true. The people of Israel and the IDF are united. We are divided from the policymakers, from Bibi and his government. And that's why we need to replace them immediately. Otherwise, I do not foresee an exit plan that is viable, that will restore Israel's strength and ability to defend any future attacks. Such horrific Saturday needs to be answered very, very hard and very, very strong, but only after we save the hostages. And the talks within the government officials about conquering Gaza and resettling Gaza and kicking 2.5 billion Palestinians to Egypt or Saudi Arabia or whatever that are mentioned in the Hague Court of Justice, they're quoting our ministers as talking nonsense, as sort of an affidavit or a testimonial to what Israel is aiming to do. The people of Israel does not support that. Yes, they won the elections in November, the year before the last, rightfully so, but they generated a government of lunatics who is driving Israel into the fall of the third house. As simple as that. So people can mask that with politics and right and left and religious and seculars and anti-Semite or not. But this is all fog to me and to many others. We need to have a solution. And by the way, I never voted, I'm 60 now, I never voted to Mr. Rabin or Mr. Peres or any of those parties. So no one can call me a leftist or an Arab affection. I'm a terror victim, right? So I'm a liberal. I'm right wing by my home and my conceptions, but I'm also a man of reality. And this government cannot eradicate Hamas, cannot intimidate Hezbollah or Iran without losing our 136 civilians there. This government does not have the trust and support of the people of Israel, period. As simple as that. And we are in a sort of a deadlock, and that's why you see people out in the streets, hundreds or thousands of them, during the war. I would have voted to do that right at the outset. But, people needed to absorb and realize what's going on and mourn. Just last night, we had 21 new fallen soldiers in a horrific situation in Khan Yunis. And soldiers are falling each and every day, and hostages are dying each and every day. And I don't see this government stating a policy that I can support and say, okay, that makes sense. Let them do that and then go to elections. Because Bibi's current intention is to prolong the war as much as possible, simply because he knows that the minute the war ends, all hell will break loose in the streets of Israel, and he will be overthrown and not be elected ever. So whether it is from his vindication of Yoni's death or a psychological analysis of being a psychopath and a narcissistic person, I'm not saying that. Professor of psychiatry say that. I do not know. I'm not an expert. But the situation is grave as long as this government governs. And that's what takes me and my brother and hundreds of thousands of Israelis out. And it started roaming up or ramping up in the last month or so. And my prediction is that as soon as war subsides a little bit and some of the military were pulled out of Gaza, more people will go and the rage will increase. And, we're a democracy. But a democracy does not mean that an elected government can ruin the foundations of the democracy.
And so what is the answer? Is it time then to negotiate?
I'm not a political figure and I'm not a policymaker, but my 2 cents or 2 pennies, if you say, is that first and foremost, you need to have a trusted government and a trusted leader. And then, yes, negotiate, release the 136 and bring them back safe, as many of them alive as possible, and then work with Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and the United States and the UK and Germany on a temporary solution for a temporary time, but one that has at least one clause to my taste, and that no military force can be close to the border of Israel anymore, not in Gaza and not in Lebanon. That should be a statement or our red line. Dealing with Hamas and Hezbollah, we can do later. I was against such negotiations at the outset, as I said before, because I thought the army can do much more in a shorter time. Since I have a couple of friends that are fighting now in Khan Yunis, I know what's going on there. The complication of warfare underneath Khan Yunis and Gaza is such that no Entebbe operation or no 136 Entebbe operations is viable. And hence, truth needs to be told, David. It's either continuing fighting in Gaza for months and months and months and sacrificing the 136 with a government that does not have the support and belief and trust of the people of Israel. The IDF claims that we're losing points because policymakers do not state what's the next phase and what's the next stage for Israel. I'm not saying that. The IDF is saying that. So it's either do that or overthrow this government overnight. We have in our democratic system a lawful ability to do that overnight without even re-elections. I don't know the English term for that, but it's a vote of inconfidence. But it's not calling for new government, but it's appointing immediately. You need 61 votes, and then you immediately appoint an alternate government. And to me, that would be the best situation for the hostages, for the IDF, and for the situation, meaning overthrowing the government, appointing a temporary government led by whomever, except Mr. Netanyahu, that will renegotiate deals for the release of the 136, pin down a date for future elections in 3 months' time, 6 months' time, propose a new constitution, or at least basic foundations for a constitution for Israel. I'm sure you know that we don't have a constitution, so we need to address that as well, and go for elections in 3 to 6 months' time on the basis of a new democratic, a new legal, a new economical, and a new social systems. All of these needs mending even before the Black Saturday. That's what we protested for before the Black Saturday, certainly following the Black Saturday. So we are not against a judicial reform. We are against the judicial reform that Mr. Levin posted. And again, Bibi is a master of using fake news and sending one into the throat of another. He thrives on that for the last 15 years. We need to put a stop to that. And we need to realign the people of Israel back to the basics of what is Zionism, what is Judaism, what is moral, and what is I lost the word. Never mind. Not that in 1976 everything was good. It was not. But at least the moral of the leadership was at the right place. Today, the moral of the leadership is in their pockets and in their seats. So we need to remove that.